Thank you very much. Welcome back to the afternoon session for our Trevor Wishart forum, if you like. And in fact, of course, we'd like to invite Trevor, if you want to see Trevor, you're happy to stand, and Trevor, like the four people who've come along, actually, we haven't briefed him. He says he'll give a general introduction, and then Mike may like to ask some questions at the end of the introduction. Then this will run as a kind of, we don't know what the four presentations will tell us. Kevin, Wei, Cormac, and Ambrose have prepared something, and they know nothing about their other presentations. We wouldn't normally at a conference, but of course it's part of Mike's idea to get different points of view rolling. So we welcome Trevor Wishart. Trevor, would you like to introduce Globalalia?
Wow, okay, yes. Well, actually, I was going to
yes.
a few general remarks, but this may now all be old hat, having listened to these very interesting presentations this morning. But very briefly, my interest in the analysis of works goes back to some comments on sonic art about the way that where we usually approach analysis in music is we study a text. And that fits in very nicely with the whole history of the academy, because the European universities developed in the Middle Ages, and their main purpose was the study of holy text. So the whole idea of studying text has a huge kudos in the university, and the same applies when you come to music, which is essentially not a textual thing, it's a sound thing. But the fact that music has text means it has real academic gravitas to look at these things. And if you have a kind of music that doesn't have a document with it, well, how are you going to deal with it in content? The electroacoustic music falls down therefore on two fronts. In the first case, there's no text. So how am I to assess what I'm listening to? There's a very practical aspect of this. A student who's not turned up for their entire 3 years of the course turns up on the last day with this absolutely fantastic piece. Now, how do you know that that student hasn't just taken an obscure work by Parmigiani and played it backwards? There's no other evidence base. So, just from a very practical point of view, we need some way of looking at being able to handle the content of electroacoustic music. Also, electroacoustic music has the opposite problem as well, particularly with computers. And we also have too much information, because usually when I finished a piece, there's a cupboard full of well, it used to be, before we went on to computer files, it used to be cupboard full of DAT tapes or analog tapes. Now there are megabytes of sound files, and some of these are clearly the sources, some of these are clearly things that happened just before the mix. There are all these incredible intermediate stages, things that are half finished, things that they decided not to use. How do you deal with that vast amount of data? How do you organize it? The same thing to say about the score is that the score is slightly deceptive. The score presents you, if you look at it, you can see, if you like, the logical structure of the work, the way the logic of the oral experience. But what you don't see from the score is the genesis of the work. You have no idea how the composer came to that particular logical structure, what strange road they went down to arrive at it. And it's often a problem when teaching young composers to make them understand the difference between the wonderful logical structure of the final piece and the fact that the composer might have started off with a completely different idea, or changed our mind halfway along, or got it completely wrong until the very last minute when they threw away the central section entirely and it worked perfectly. So those are important distinctions. Another interesting window on this problem is how do you make a living as an electroacoustic musician? Well, one of the ways you make a living is you talk about what you do. And you make a lot more money talking about what you do than you do playing the music. And so, partly as a consequence of that, I've always written up my pieces afterwards with lots of sound examples, so I have lecture material. In fact, if you haven't seen it yet, I've put all those into a book called sound composition, which I noticed was hovering around on some benches here. But so I've always done that process of, if you like, backing up the knowledge about my pieces. And also, I think it's helpful. I'm interested in that didactic thing, that I'd like people to know how I make my pieces, what I'm trying to do, how I approach making them. But of course, the problem with that is, that's my view, and often the composer's view is ideologically biased. You automatically think what you're doing is good or valuable or whatever, or you wouldn't be doing it. And it might be complete rubbish or illogical or whatever. Therefore, you need other people. The last thing I'd like to say really is about, well, what you look for in the analysis of a piece. One is what I call the logical structure of the work. How does the how does the piece work as a listening experience? How do you relate what happens at the beginning to what happens in the middle to what happens in the end? Are there any relationships? Are there important relationships and so on? Then there's the technical devices that we use to construct it. And so in Globalalia, for example, I developed this way of time-stretching iterative sound. That was a particular technical development in that piece. There are lots of other smaller ones because I'm developing tools and methods all the time when I'm working, because I enjoy that. I might be simple extensions of older processes that I realise would be better if they had a more broader application, or it may be combinations of processes putting these together. For example, at the moment I'm trying to model a kind of fluid flow in sound, and to do that I built an interface which calls in about 4 different programs of the CDP, uses them together as if they were all the same program. So in one sense I'm not creating anything new, but actually I'm creating a kind of framework in which I can make this new piece, which I can give information about how this fluid flows, and that goes away and finds the right CDP program and brings it in and does those processes. Those are 2 approaches. There are other approaches, though. We'd like to know, perhaps, about the aesthetics or the poetics of the work. And I think these are things that we tend to overlook in the electroacoustic community, simply because the thing that binds us is the technology. We're all here because we happen to work in this area where either, in the old days, there was a mixing desk in the department. The department could actually afford to buy a mixing desk or a tape recorder for that matter. And now we're all bound together by computers. And so what we have in common is the technology. And so it's a lot easier to talk about the technological devices, the software, the hardware we're using and so on, than it is to talk about what music means or what the poetics of music is. And there's another interesting angle, particularly in relation to Globalalia, which is the actual history of the piece. Because Globalalia started out as a completely different piece. My original idea was, I'd been travelling around Europe a lot gigging, and whichever country I went to, there were these particular shows with DJs in the traditional sense that they played records, and they had this patter. And they all spoke different languages, but the pattern was always the same. They stole these jokes and they had these funny voices and they had strange sound effects. And I thought, yes, it's interesting that I don't know what you call this, the syntax of this kind of speech is interesting, because it doesn't depend on you being able to understand what they're saying. You know, they're trying to be funny or witty or with it or whatever. It would be interesting to make a piece which put all these things together. So I wrote up to various friends saying, look, can you get me recordings of these DJs exactly where you are? I'd like to collect them together to make this piece. But for various reasons, my instructions were either ignored or misinterpreted, or I wasn't clear. And people sent me simpler recordings of people speaking, which they recorded from the radio in various places. And I have to admit now that most of the collection of 26 languages come from Australia. At least 18 of the languages I use in Globalalia were collected from various communities in Melbourne by Warren Bird. Because it seems there's a Maltese radio station, for example, in Melbourne. the whole point of the piece changed just after I began, because I didn't get the materials I wanted to. But I became fascinated by listening to these recordings, and browsing through bookshops as I do, I came across this new publication called The Sounds of the World's Languages, which is a description by phoneticists, perhaps, of the sounds used in every known language in the world. Like, for example, the section on the famous clicks. There were so many of them, so many combinations. I hadn't imagined there's a combination together with each other, with a combination with vowel production, a combination with other consonants, and so on. Absolute amazing panoply of sonic material. And so this shifted my focus again, and I started to look at the material and decide how on earth I would work with it. So I went through this long process in the end of dividing it into syllables and pairs of syllables. So that's one thing that I probably never mentioned to anyone, that I actually divided the whole lot into not only these 8,300 syllables, but, well, one hell of a lot of pairs of syllables. In the end, I only used the pairs of syllables in one of the variations in Globalalia, the one which I call Tristan, if you've seen the diffusion score, because it uses a Tristan chord as a filtering device. And I start off by using pairs of syllables, the only one of which is tuned to the chord I'm interested in. And then I remove one of the syllables so it begins to focus more on the pitches I'm interested in. And then I apply the filtering to it, so I actually focus the spectral energy on those pitches. So that gives us kind of 4 types of analysis. There's the logical structure of the piece, there's the technical devices used to make the piece, there's the aesthetics and poetics of the work, and then the actual history, or the genesis, if you like. How did this piece come about? Why did it come about? You know, what did the composer have for breakfast, kind of analysis. Right, so those are my general comments on this thing, and I think now I'd like to hear what other people have to say. Well, of course, I'm fascinated to know what other people make of it, what make of the piece and how they approach it, and to have some input, perhaps, into their comments.
Thank you. Have a seat of honour, Trevor, and do feel free to question anybody that sounds. Mike, you take over the chair and introduce us.
Well, I do a little brief introduction, I suppose, to this, just to explain. Obviously, Trevor's done a bit of explanation. But for my personal interest, perhaps, in terms of Orama and why I wanted Trevor to be the composer that would ultimately submit something for the as part of the archive. I had the opportunity to work with Trevor as part of another project to archive another piece called Imago, and he was one of the only composers I've worked with on this project who actually has very succinct notes and documents pertaining to the not just the actual piece and its creation, but also the compositional processes that he undertook within the CDP environment. And to the extent, I believe you were saying that with the one sound you start with, you could load it into CDP or sound loom, and then build the whole piece up based on the historical data, which I found fascinating, because you could obviously go back then and see all the individual processes which led up to that. So, whereas other composers who I worked with on the project were giving me Pro Tools sessions with just the bare minimum files, which were basically the final outcome, and maybe the automation and the various plugins, but nothing pertaining to the actual compositional process. So it's been fantastic that we've had access to Trevor's archives in that regard. And of course, I'd like to thank all the contributors who are going to talk now and give their sketches on Globalalia. Obviously, these aren't, we asked for sketches and not final definitive analyses, but how they might offer a different perspective on the same work. And that's the intention of this particular session. So if I can invite Kevin, all right? Great.
Thank you. So, sorry, I don't have any PowerPoint. As a matter of fact, it's quite funny because I was analyzing Globalalia is something very particular for me. I usually don't like works using or having a very large importance made on voices. That's something I'm very far from it because I usually like to analyze what I call or computer music, which is very algorithmic music. And so I tend to look from very far to something which is too close to the human being or human voices when I expression. And as a matter of fact, I was doing my usual PowerPoint armor, with nice spectrograms and bullet points presentation, when suddenly my laptop battery just exploded. Literally. So I thought, well, maybe it's just the fate sign or something like that, because it forced me to do this presentation based on traces of what I was planning to do without having the complete, very defined outline I was planning to do. So that's one aspect because of what is very particular to me to analyze Globalalia. The other thing is that just before reading the call for the EOLEMA journal focusing on Globalalia, I had a discussion with a colleague in France who wrote a book called Globalalia dans la musique contemporaine. So it's based really on what is Globalalia for contemporary composers, score composer, based on Ligeti, Nouvelle Adventure. So I had this discussion going on, and this called so I guess it's inevitable for me. I'm the first one to introduce to make my presentation. So I got the easy part of saying, well, Globalalia is speaking in terms in the fluid vocalizing, or less commonly the writing of speech-like syllables that lack any readily comprehended meaning, in some cases as part of religious practice. So it comes from the Greek glossa, meaning language, and the verb lalein, which is talking. So obviously, my view on Globalalia started with this semantic meaning of glossolalia. But there's a pun, of course, on global glossal. So I'll get back to glossolalia. It's a religious aspect, but it's some kind of almost sectarian aspect of religion. To the point, it also designed some. It's also used for pathological condition where a patient is speaking incoherently with just silence, making up a language. So I think my point of departure for this analysis was questioning this relationship between Globalalia based on sound recorded from everywhere, so kind of syllable-like experience or something, making up a language through technology. So the other step for me is the question that is technology in Globalalia thought as or being responsible for loss of semantics or sense. What is another level which is very interesting for me is that in the notes, which I couldn't resist to read from your website, there's a note somewhere telling that the processes used in Globalalia are very analog-like and not digital inspired. So maybe for me, the first step of analysis is asking the question, is technology, and possibly even more digital technology, responsible for loss of sense in human communication? That's the first point I'm asking you. I'm asking that. The other thing is that the piece is based on a special kind of narrative with a main narrative and 20, if I remember correctly, episodes of different stories. So it's interesting because there's also in the form of the piece a kind of tension between what I call what is called in narration or narrative analysis intra or extra diegetic levels of the discourse. So you have a tension between what is going on from the beginning to the end of the piece, which is like the extra diegetical level, and what is going on during each of the episodes, which I call intra-diegetic level. So it all relates to meanings once again. Is there a fusion between those different levels through the piece? Is there semantics to be found inside the different episodes, inside the piece as a whole, or is the meaning coming from outside, which is the form as a whole? My usual way of dealing with those aspects is getting back to a tool I devised, which is called schizmogenetical analysis, which is based on Bason's idea on social anthropology, which is finding the elements that provide evolutions when being made forced into contact. For example, you have, if I get back to the example of Friday this morning, with in Parmigiani, it's very easy to make sure that works, because you have those kind of isolated elements that come into contact and then possibly transform themselves and go elsewhere. So that's a very easy take for the schizmogenetical analysis. It works. On Globalalia, it's much more difficult to find an evolution that works within the concept of schizmogenetic analysis. It means I can't find at the moment, or maybe I won't find elements that made into contact are fusion to something else. So that's what another aspect that got me challenged on this piece. This is a very complex work. I didn't want to go to the genetic aspect of the work and looking through all the notes, but I did. So I know there's a lot of sound files. I know you had to cut a lot of sounds and arrange them in some kind of database, find a way to combine everything. So that's very complex from the part of the composer. It's fairly easy to listen. My daughter, which is 13 years old, just listen to it. So it's 30 minutes. It's no problem. Well, because there's kind of maybe using the human voice offers some kind of affordance for the listener. But if you go into detail, it's awfully complex, and it's much more complex than some of the pieces I impose to my students in masters to analyze string quartets, stuff like that. You know. But I wanted to analyze why it is so complex for me to get to the ethos of global work. So maybe to account for the complexity of this work, we have 4 levels. The first level is the music itself. I mean, taking the form, the structures, and analyzing, like, to get back to the usual analytical discourse as the neutral level. That's the first way of doing it. The second way is what you talked about, the processes, exactly focusing on how it was made, and then going into the poetic aspects of doing the work. Maybe a third way of doing that is going back even further into the sources, and without all the editing, and just examining what are the sources, which is an approach which I would call infra-poetic, or you could call it philological, or whatever. And then, obviously, that's the meaning aspect, because I generally tend to get away from this question of meaning. But in Globalalia, I feel you can't avoid to ask you the question, what is the meaning of all the piece? Is there specific meanings glued together to form a more complex meaning? Is there a general meaning into which you are arranging some nuggets of information? I'm still asking. So, what to do when you are confronted to such a complex system? Well, my reaction was to consider that as a musical being and something which is as kind of a biological aspect to it, organic aspect. And considering that what we hear is musical being, not musical structure, not musical objects, not musical structure in the sense that I think that in Globalalia you can't fix in time the different structures. Not musical events, because in some way it's unpredictable. It has a way of playing with the sounds and the meaning that are linked to the syllables in some way, and trying to make them go elsewhere. One aspect of this is the different loops that are present at some point in the works. This aspect of rhythm is also very different from what we normally in language or syllable like music. So I guess this is a key point, because it marks in some way another way of looking at musical composition, electronic musical composition. It's going on to bio/logical time. It is. We are looking at something that's at the frontiers of differences and repetition. It's just a flashback from Gilles Deleuze's book on difference and repetition. I don't know if it's translated to English. But it has this kind of duality. And in order to account this complexity, we can only choose to have biological tools or envisaging music as musical beings. So, well, I guess that's it. What I got from my recollection of what I was trying to present and what I'll be presenting. That's it.
I've forgotten what I said. Oh, well, if you my feeling is to get all four done. But if you want to make it, they absolutely
I'm very good at forgetting.
Yeah.
It's the interesting thing about I think your analysis is discussing it. I'm not sure I thought about it. Okay. But one thing I think it comes at Marco, which is exactly the opposite. Whereas in Marco, there's this what we call time theme, which everything is generated. Globalalia is absolutely the opposite. You bring together these thousands of I don't know. Or I've heard of it.
Thank you, Joe. You're quite right. These many comments are truly clear. Mike, you're going to check.
Yeah, hello everybody. Yeah, I'm Wei Jing. I'm a PhD student at the Globalalia and I was very happy and just full of pleasure to listen to. And in my presentation, I'm talking about looking into the Globalalia, and I want to. With a lot of electroacoustic analysis, is very into the sound and object. But I'm more interested in the semantics, in the context of sound, especially language, when you're talking, when you compose with the language. So I want to address a little bit in the, for me, it's a personal experience. Listening to Globalalia is a complete audiovisual experience for me. I would imagine different ways, because I can identify a certain language in, so I was seeing face chopping, throat shaking, so I began to get very interested in how it could look like as such a wonderful notion of language. So, and well, I did a small. I read the book, which was very detailed, from Trevor Wishart for some composition. So it was 134 voices in 26 different languages, and it was decomposed into continued syllables and a syllable pair, like you were introducing. And it was a multiple sound source was selected, prepared, and organized, and I think it was orchestrated into electroacoustic vocal ensemble, because everybody was speaking the same wording with different languages. So, and I was very interested in the form and the presentation of the piece. It was being as described in the book. It was a short connected piece and a narrative, referring a storytelling, thousand Arabic nights. So I thought for me it was an audio book with and it's non-linear narrative storytelling audio book, and of course the sound of the language was contextualized, but then they being put in a context of unification of common human speech practice. So I think the piece actually merged the boundary of culture and the languages, which we have to spend a lot of time to study different language to understand cultures, and I think it's kind of approaching and achieving a universal understanding of human vocal expression. And as a Chinese is my mother tongue, when I look at the language, I'm seeing pictures. Yeah, and so for me, if you change the Western writing to whole capital, I have to retranslate it. I have to write it down, and then so there's another way to see language for me. So so I began to do a little bit research on what writing shape has been developed or being explored in graphic and language base. So I come across to this Islamic writings, and being called a new post literature. So it's a work that's open Semitic form of writing. They have no verbal sense, maybe have a clearly textual sense. It suggests a type of document, and it suggests a meaning. And it's a form of art. It's still in writing. It's often a character in form, and either depends on the reader's sense of and the knowledge of the writing system that they are familiar with, wherever they come from, and it depends on the reader to make a sense, and it can be understood through poetical ingenuity. So, and it's seen as a relative perception. So unknown language, any kind of forgotten scripts, they can provide a template and a platform for new model of expressions. And I think it's kind of similar to what the audio achievement Globalalia was giving to me. So, and there was a very important work that was very inspiring. That's from a Chinese artist. His name is Xu Bin, and he have created this large installation. And you can see it's a Chinese-looking character, but it's totally meaningless. I don't know what they are. I don't know the sound. I don't know the meanings. But it's given a sense of narrative within the text. As you read, you can choose to read because Chinese is composing left and right and up and down. You can choose to read, and you can decide yourself to what you're gonna, how you want to the meaning and to be the sound of the text. And so I'm just gonna say a little bit. And so it's a designed vocabulary of 4,000 characters, which appear in term to be Chinese, but there's linguistic. There's no meaning in linguistic. So in China, I would just like we have the left part and the right part and up and down parts of split Chinese, and often is the key a radical of. So we have 9,000 Chinese written characters, so was more used usually to use, and they are being classified as 540 radicals. Look, if you look at this sample, so that up part is mountain, and it has a sound of shan. And this part is the worker, gong. And that part, the chuan, it means dogs. So, but when you put all this together, it reminds me of the mind, the workers under the marking. So these are very poetic, and they've been working very hard. People be, so you can combine this, and you can all look at it as a graphic art too. So I was, from my approach, I was thinking about this audible singable to BS. How to say this? Versus like a visible radicals, and the language element, both audible and visible, and what's their individual semantic and combined expressions. And so I want to approach Globalalia with a visual semantic analysis, if I can, and maybe translate it into aesthetic writing looking visual work. If it's an audiobook, you can release written. So, yeah, this is what I very inspiring, because I was completely audiovisual experience, and I really enjoy it. I have myself also working with language, and very interesting how to translate not meaningfully but three-dimensionally as language, how they transform actually within ourselves. So that's what I come up with. Thank you.
It's a fascinating idea. I've actually seen this artwork in Weimar.
And it's also analog.
Yeah.
He did this on wood,
Yeah,
and he printed it himself. And then he was going through a very difficult time in our country, being thrown out of the country because he's not normalized. So I think it's very inspiring artist.
He also did these three phoenixes.
The birds. Yeah, I was very interested when he put birds. That's another work for the bird, which he translated English writing through English, and then he put the birds, like he moved the bee around and become a bird, and become a Chinese traditional characters simplify and become bones. So it's literally transforming, not translating. So I mean, they all have some musical approach for me. So I'm actually doing very similar approach.
Okay, so hello, and thanks for having me. This was quite an interesting idea, so I apologize in advance if it's slightly confusing or slightly jet-lag. But I got an email on my holiday saying it was something I'd be interested in doing, and having never really attempted this sort of analysis either, I thought it might be a good idea. So the title of this is just Speaking in Grayscale, Approaching Trevor Wishart's Globalalia through Heuristic Continuums. So basic idea for my attempted analysis would be putting Globalalia through a system of a classification system built up of different dualistic continuums. So this is building from my research for my PhD. Which is kind of designing a classification system built on dualistic continuums. I actually use this system for composition. So in a sense, this is inverting the system to try and see if you can learn anything about an already composed piece from doing it, or if it builds any kind of interesting discussions over terminology that I'm using and stuff like that, and whether it's even possible. So basically the system that I'm attempting to design is built up of different dualistic continuums, but it mainly deals with meta or sort of macro compositional decision making, not sort of minute details, minute sound details or morphologies or anything like that. Subjectivity is kind of inherent in some of the continuums because it's more to get the composer thinking about the choices that they might have to make, or choices that they might usually subconsciously make. It incorporates other people's research and other people's terminology into the system, and in that way it's sort of partly being designed potentially as a sort of pedagogical tool to show people different choices that they have and then whose research has dealt with those choices. It has sort of two potential modes of operation as I'm sort of looking at it at the minute, which is a forward use, which is using it for your composition practice, and then backwards perhaps looking at someone else's proposed piece, which is the intention and deception ideas coming from this specific project. In terms of starting points for analysis, I'm kind of viewing it as perhaps a naked version, an informed version, which is basically the idea would be you either approach the piece that you're going to analyse with no kind of preconceived notions about what the piece is about. Potentially probably you can't avoid the title of the piece, but you maybe know nothing else about it, and then informed would be with, I guess, a series of background knowledge or other analyses to look at the piece. And the same would go for composing, to either make arbitrary decisions about what the piece is going to be about, and which characteristics it might deal with, and then compose the piece and tie it all together, or you start from a concept, and then you decide how it fits, how that concept can fit those characters. So what we've got here is my sort of first draft of the system. I don't know how legible that is. I like to do things analog style. And also my handwriting's terrible. So as you can see, it's kind of broken up into 5 different categories. So you've got performance, sound source, language, form, and production. And then within those, you've got different sort of different dualistic pairs. So, for instance, up here you can see there's like field recording as opposed to controlled recordings. So I'll just show you a few of some of these are quite changeable, and then we'll show you that someone's form and medic abstract up there, and then we've got tonal versus atonal. Over here, live versus fixed media. And for me, this is just a way of looking at my composition, so I can see a lot of the choices that I have to make before I start. And whether or not I engage with all of these continuums would depend on the piece, obviously. And I like to kind of make a rough guess as to where I might land a continuum as I'm concluding. So if I was looking at live versus fixed, I would say, okay, I want it to be somewhere in the middle of live versus fixed, and what would that mean for the piece? So this is just a close-up of language as it is at the minute. It's varies with vague. These little circles with numbers in them obviously refer back to references to other people's research. So I should point out actually this one has a little circle in it, but tonical versus atonical is a tag, I think, term. It's just a piece that has a tonical. So my attempt was to sort of take all of these continuums and look at Globalalia through these, I guess. And this was my vague attempt at that about 2 days ago. And I had never encountered the piece before, so it was quite interesting in that respect. And I didn't look at any of the material that was there initially, and then had a very brief look at it afterwards. So the sort of dotted line, if you imagine it's a scale running from like 0 to 1 and 0.5 is kind of an equal balance of the two things, which would be the center of those boxes. That's kind of how I was thinking about it. So the dashed lines are, I guess, my initial impressions, and then the straight line, they've maybe been adjusted a little bit after I learned a little bit about the piece. So for me, some of them proved more fruitful, I guess, for my thinking. Like obviously, live versus fixed. As far as I understand it, it's completely fixed. So obviously, this is just right on the other end of the scale. And some of them are completely unapplicable, I guess. So a lot of things to do with live are obviously then not applicable. And this sort of just narrows down the options, I guess, for me. And then these are the ones that I found quite stimulating. So in the system, I've sort of designated narrative versus absolute. You might say programmatic or something versus absolute music. And just through listening to the piece, I felt like it's fairly abstract, I guess, without any knowledge of the piece. But in terms of feeling like there was a narrative that it was about something, and the actual title, I guess, implying at least two different things, I felt it was actually more towards narrative. And then, as a kind of like more refining from that, I went into textual versus illustrative. So whether it's based on text or it's more illustrative of, you know, a scenic place or something like that. So whether it's about illustrative might refer to a musical representation of walking through a field or something like that. Whereas textual might be a literal setting of a text. And then refining from that down again, language-based as opposed to text-based. So I felt the piece was more language-based, was more dealing with the characteristics of language and syntax and that sort of thing, as opposed to text-based. So starting with a set text and representing that text. So maybe on the very other end of the scale, if you could accept spoken, just literally spoken word as a form of music, then that would be the very, very far side of the text-based versus language-based continuum. Obviously, yeah. So I find this quite interesting because for me, the piece throws up interesting questions about perception of language. So for me, whenever I was listening to it, I guess I could hear different accents. And I thought, oh, well, someone else who was listening to it would be able to pick out slightly other accents. And in particular, I sort of find myself classifying, this is actually without any knowledge, I find myself classifying different parts of the piece as perhaps dealing with different syllables that were more, I guess, more used in certain languages. And so then that gave that sort of section of the piece for me a kind of geographical position. And then this led me to sort of, Manuel Blackburn's kind of continuum here, sonic souvenir versus culturally familiar. Sonic souvenir being something that obviously you have recorded from another culture that you aren't so familiar with, and then culturally familiar sounds to be something that you're actually very much not. But on an initial listen, I thought, okay, so it's more of a sonic souvenir, but then I had a question about, well, if I'm analysing this from the sound source, should it be my perception of that, so how familiar those sounds are to me, or how familiar I think they are to you when we compose the piece? And I think overall I know it's right to me, and then I have to make it clear that this is my personal interpretation of those sounds and how familiar they are to me. But I thought that was possibly quite a fruitful area of analysis, I guess. And possibly this one as well, I thought it's interesting. It's just multi-movement as opposed to continuous work. My initial listen, you can see I felt it was quite continuous. I didn't really perceive the same sense of different movements. I perceived that there was recurring material, but I wasn't entirely sure if I would class them as separate movements. And then as I read a little bit more about it, I actually changed my mind and thought, oh, it's maybe more this way. And so I kind of just used this really to get me thinking about the piece and the different issues that might arise from the piece. So I think, yeah. So in conclusions, vague conclusions, I might have come to so far from just attempting this, is that the system is a useful starting point for an analysis, but requires refinement and outside analysis techniques to back up perhaps some of the choices that I would make, and therefore they are subjectively my choices, but I might be able to back up some of them through more concrete analysis. It's useful for stimulating discussion about it, and it's also a visual representation of the characteristics of a work. So you can glance at it and you can say, oh, that's Tony's perception of the work on those scales. Without information, it's hard to glean from the naked piece. Some categories were very problematic to kind of make a mark on and continue as to where the piece lay. So it would be interesting to find out if that's true. It probably is true, but it's interesting. It would be interesting to find out if that's true for all the works that we attempt to do as well. And if it was the same categories. Also, I thought Globalalia could be a good example used for students in order to stimulate thought about particular continuums related to language, text, sound source choice, meaning and interpretation. And it might be quite interesting to present students with that sort of chart, make them listen to the piece, and then see what varying results you got, and whether they correlated in some categories more than others. And then get them to discuss why they thought that. And then obviously there were certain categories that it just didn't engage with, which is good because that means you can say, oh well, it's not a piece that does this, but some other piece might be a piece that does that, but there were some that are very much felt like they were the sort of important ones to me. So that's kind of my initial foray, I guess, into it.
I think you just to extreme with the live versus fixed.
Sure.
I usually perform Globalalia with diffusion score.
Oh yes, sorry, of course, yeah.
It's slightly different.
Yeah.
And it's open to interpret. So perhaps you should start with my tricky.
Yeah, for sure. This is actually when I did the presentation about the system, SSP. I said, oh well, it's actually quite difficult to say that any piece is totally on the right hand side, and diffusion definitely goes back. And I was just literally basing that off of just listening to the piece on SoundCloud.
The other interesting one, you're talking about text versus language. It doesn't so much about Globalalia, but with the piece encounters, where I actually use whole spoken phrases, I have this problem essentially, in that it's meant to be a language piece, but I can't help but understand the text.
Yeah.
There are two completely different meanings of piece depending on whether you understand the text or whether you don't.
Yeah.
It's supposed to work function as a piece of music if you don't understand the text.
Yeah, I mean, I love those kind of things, you know, because if you might listen to a piece that's in Spanish, has a very specific political meaning with the words, or you know, like a certain speech or something like that, and then not being familiar with Spanish, you have no idea, so you just have to accept it as sound or as cultural as sound, but then someone will speak Spanish, and speak Spanish, and that's a really different interaction.
Where are you based? We know, some of us know you, some of us don't. Where are you based?
I'm based in Liverpool, Hope. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to comment on not understanding a language to listen to. You actually appreciate much more the language as itself when actually you understand the meaning. I'm always lost in, for example, I like certain songs, and then you begin to understand the meaning, the text is very whiny.
Yeah, for sure. You can take something away.
You listen different. You listen to the meaning, then the whole as a sounder. I think I'm not understanding sometimes.
Sometimes it's good. Yeah, for sure.
And our final Trevor.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me again. So today, or in this presentation, I'm going to talk a bit obviously about how I've thought about my approach analysing Globalalia. And the three main things that I'm going to talk about is my adopted listening approach, which relates to things that relates to ideas of recurrence, which I've talked a little bit about before at the symposium. And something that I'm also going to talk about is the importance of initial listening, which may seem blindingly obvious, but to me it was very important, especially listening to this work, which I hadn't heard before. It was actually really nice, a really great experience, having to devote myself to suddenly doing an analysis again, and immersing myself in this, and throwing up all kinds of questions which I possibly haven't considered while completing my PhD research. So those are some of the things that I'll talk about. So what I wanted to do is take this idea of recurrence that I developed through my PhD and try and apply it to this piece of music and see if it could apply. And that was actually quite a daunting task, because when I was doing my research, you obviously go through and find pieces and think, oh, well, this one works quite well for what I'm trying to talk about, and this one works quite well, so I'll talk about these, because they illustrate the ideas that I'm developing. So it was with some trepidation that I started listening, and I'll say later on to my relief, there were things that I could talk about, rather than not have anything to say.
Oh, it's true.
But what does this mean, talking about recurrence? And really what I'm talking about, I suppose, is it's possibly sounds that repeat. It could be sounds that are similar, it's sounds that remind of earlier material. It's really webs of correspondence, different ways that things might be connected in our experience of the work. So it doesn't necessarily mean direct repetition, but it can involve that. And like I say, these are ideas that I investigated in my PhD, so I've kind of broken them up here into issues of correspondence. I've got how things appear to relate to one another, what those aspects might be, and then temporal relationships, in other words, different time spans over these related sounds are operating. And there are other factors that are important that I haven't put in bold, such as the structural functions that sounds appear to fulfill, the expectations that they evoke, either when they appear for the first time, what you think the sound is going to do, and possibly when it reappears, is it going to do the same thing again or do something different? And obviously issues of memory become important in all this, and naturally, because we're talking about electroacoustic music, issues of space become incredibly significant. But this is my sort of diagram of some of the ways that you can think about these things. So I've got issues of correspondence, and I've sort of divided them, well, not divided them, but I've provided two different ways that you might look at aspects of correspondence. So you might be more inclined towards the spectral and morphological features of the sound, or you might be inclined towards its source associations. And in terms of temporal relationships, you might be thinking global relationships over long time scales or local relationships. But what I'm at pains to say is that the diagram is messier, or the reality is messier than this diagram might suggest. I mean, I think everything's going on in the middle, and perhaps a more fruitful way to look at it would be to actually start from the middle outwards and say, well, we have these recurrent phenomena, and is it operating over a global time scale? Are these connections spectromorphological, or is it based on the source that I'm seeing? But actually, probably those two things are interrelated anyway, so I can't divide them up. So it does all become quite sort of messy, but it's good to have a starting point, I think. So how might I use these ideas when listening and analysing? And which concepts do you go to first? Do you go through piecemeal and break the work up? Or do you take an overall overarching view of it? Is there some sort of method or approach? And I mean, I think it depends on the work. I mean, in the instance of listening to Globalalia, I was certainly drawn towards getting some kind of overview. But I guess that was because I listened through in one big way and tried one big way, just in one sweep, and wanted to get a sense of what my impression of this work was, basing my listening experience as the starting point for these analytical observations. So, what I took from it. Which is what I said here. So although I was looking at an overview initially, that wouldn't suggest that then you ignore sort of more local relationships, but things like repetitions or variations, integrations, sort of small time scales. But perhaps those detailed aspects can be returned to later and actually maybe need perhaps more attention to actually understand or to get a better sense of the detail of what's going on. And this is sort of a brief diversion, because this was an idea that I came across relatively recently. This idea of resonating reminiscences from receiving patterns. He talks about how form is accumulated in the mind of the listener, and that large-scale form is the shape of experience through time, and it's resonating reminiscences rather than a structure out of time that one holds before the idea in its entirety. And I found this quite helpful as a way of thinking about, well, what do I think about form and what is form? And it drew attention to me to the idea of, well, obviously, because we're dealing with music time and the perception of its form, but emphasising this experiential nature of form, what is held in consciousness during listening and what actually retains, or what is retained afterwards. So this sort of phrase, resonating reminiscences, is sort of stuck in my mind ever since, really. So a formal impression might be established through these resonating reminiscences and our shaped experience, but which are the resonating reminiscences that linger in memory when listening to this piece? And how might recurrent ideas contribute to these reminiscences? So, that's what I mentioned earlier. So luckily, Globalalia is rich in recurrent phenomena. That was my first conclusion on listening, and very suitable for such an analysis. In many ways, it's almost so rich in recurrent phenomena that actually diagnosing them all and going through piecemeal, or not piecemeal, but trying to identify everything seemed like quite an overwhelming task. But anyway, so again, in considering this, it started making me think, well, how am I listening and analysing? Am I examining the mapped out terrain of the work, creating some kind of graphical representation that then I kind of refer back to, and then I lose my my listening perspective? Or might I also want to account for my experience of the work from a particular point of view? And this is something that I increasingly feel that needs to be, for me anyway, a starting point of any sort of analysis. And I know that while Mathieu has talked about this distinction between the analyst and the listener, and my paraphrased summary is that certain observations may not be permissible in real-time listening. This is what they're suggesting, but somehow I think it's important, and I want my listening experience to be represented within these analytical observations. So it's some kind of balance for me between exploring the detail of events and work, so this analytic approach, but also these important first impressions that frame my idea of what the work is to me. So yeah. So I guess what I'm basically saying is that my impressions from that initial first experience can and probably should inform how I undertake such an analytical task. But how might I capture those perspectives, and how do I avoid them getting lost along the way? Because you have an audio file and you can scan back and you can look in great detail at the little bits that are going on. You can find correspondences with other things, but then perhaps I've lost the real essence of what this piece was. So this is why I'm saying, for me, these first listenings are important. So actually, the fact that I had limited time in preparing this was quite good, because I had to say to myself, well, what strikes me as important about this piece in the first instance, and what makes it a unique experience, and what I also recognised was that I do tend to question a lot during those first listenings. I don't have any answers, but it's a stream of questions, especially when thinking, actually I'm going to be analysing this piece, because that's the kind of background context. So what I'm going to just sort of summarise now is just some of these questions I'll try and whiz through, so I don't go on forever. And some of these are obviously not distinct to a recurrence-based approach, but what is the territory or sound world or the domain of this work? What's its totality? Just in a fairly, not simple way, but just considering it in quite a sort of contained sense. And what does that mean to me? And how does it emotionally affect me as a human being with my experience and knowledge of our everyday world because of the vocal sounds? But then there are these granular sounds and these pulsed sounds and these abstractions of sounds. And how do I relate to that with all of my experience of either the world outside or listening to other electroacoustic music? How do I make sense of all this? And what is the meaning to you, really? And then we get to these issues of form. What is my resulting form and impression? And how do I even describe this? And what do I mean by form anyway? Which brings me back to the Helen thing, but also reminds of the first symposium in November. And it's perhaps a problematic issue, or something that deserves so much consideration. I certainly perceived sectional distinctions, endings and beginnings, but what are the similarities and differences among these sections? And are there any recurrent sectional features that perhaps aren't anything to do with the sound material, but they're things that I hear are happening again? So moving on from sections, we've got things like sectional identities, and I admit to doing some clock watching on my second listening through, which was my final listening through. And these may not be accurate, but it was a quick glance up and try and work out, right, it's there. I'll make a note of where I think things have stopped and started. But then this made me think, well, do any of these sections recur? And how do these sections progress? And do any progressions recur? How are we moving through these passages? And is it the motion through the passage that's as important, again, as the sound material? Which I suppose in its sense, perhaps, I'm just thinking off the cuff now, poses the question of if you had automated analytical software and things like this, would they pick up on these kinds of recurrent phenomena that are more a subject of one's interpretation and attention, and not necessarily entirely scientific? Are there any significant structural functions? For instance, particular kinds of onsets or terminations that seem to be recurring. And for me, one of the features was, especially the second time I listened, the granular material that appears to feature as each of the sections that I identify as they commence, and why is that significant? And things. Then there are various particular identities or sounds. For instance, like the yell. Well, I've called it the yell, but it's the sound that opens the work. It's a male, sounds like a male vocal utterance. recurrence, and why does it recur, and why is it important? And is it important to me because it occurs frequently, or is it because it resonates with me in a primal way? And what does that mean about how I relate to the piece of music? So, in a sense, I suppose I'm talking about how does the idea of recurrence actually make this sound memorable and become a part of my significant experience? You know, and it creates marker points. It gives me a sense of temporal perspective of the piece. I'm concerned to make sure that I don't dwell on that. Then I've talked about granular vocal sounds. How do these textures correspond? And why do they occur at the beginning of the sections, and how and why do they differ? What are their commonalities? And the significance of different kinds of vocal sounds, different syllables. They seem to be in different languages. I haven't read any of the background material, but this is what I gleaned from it. I can pick out bits that sounded familiar and bits that were less familiar. And how are they significant to my impression of accumulating form? Or my accumulating impression of form? And then we have, lastly, pulsed, these regular iterative sounds, which were a very significant feature for me. And how do they correspond? What are their pulse rates significant? They seem to be progressively, or are they progressively slow or faster? Do they perform similar functions or not? So there were certain sort of questions that kept coming back, and I don't actually have any answers for all these, but hopefully it sort of illustrates how I might actually approach this. And then there were some other issues that I noticed, things like rhythmic, melodic, pitch profiles, and how do they relate? I was hearing kind of whole tone tonalities or harmonies, and issues of abstraction, certain passages where sounds are processed in a certain way, and I'm taking on a process of moving away from the source of the sound, and in other passages I'm hearing the sounds repeatedly, and then they dissociate because of my perception changing. So those are some of the other things. And then finally, how do I move beyond just saying that things have happened? This whole issue of interpretation. What are the significant sounds in my listening experience, and why are they significant, and what cultural aspects affect my interpretation? And why is my attention drawn to these sounds, even if they only occasionally recur? And what does that mean? Why are they striking? So I've got some more things, but I think that's enough. So thank you.
I was just going to say that was fascinating, very, very close listening. And certainly a lot of questions there that I don't know the answer to.
Mike, you want to take over the chair for general discussion? Sure. And we can overrun 1/2 past. What we'll do is we'll have a not lengthy tea break. You can just come and grab a coffee and break, but we'll actually carry straight on. So overrun 3:30.
Okay, great. I mean, that was highly interesting for me, and hopefully for everyone else. I have two main questions. One for the presenters, and then one finally for Trevor, which will hopefully start off the general discussion that everyone else can obviously join in. And the first one is, I know some of the presenters here mentioned the archive that they had access to and how that might have affected it. And just generally, I know some of you used it more than others, how did that ultimately inform your analysis, and did it actually change how you analyse the piece once you had access to that information, than if you were to have just the audio of the piece? I don't know if anyone wants to start on that discussion. Other presenters?
Yeah, well, it was interesting because I think I made a conscious decision to not look at it first. Because I have this weird feeling that if I looked at it first, I would have been instantly coloured as to the perceptions, and then I wouldn't be able to get away from that. Whereas at least if I listened to it first without it, I could come up with some initial perceptions that could be completely wrong, but I would then be able to kind of modify it from that point of view, and could still kind of hold on to them if I liked them a lot for personal reasons. But it was also interesting because some of the archive material I didn't really have any context to it.
Right.
So you said, because initially you were saying that you wanted these signs of game shows and chemicals and stuff like that. So I looked at that letter and I went, oh brilliant, so that's what the piece is all about. And then of course that, it turns out that that's not actually what happened when the signs were got. So without the context of that being an initial foray into trying to get some signs, in a sense the archive was not misleading, but we could send you on the wrong track. Which was quite interesting when the writer was saying that's not what happened. Because I nearly broke it up.
Well, I guess the interesting thing that I found was that there was a difference between perhaps interpretation of the piece and then the actual composer intentions. And I think that was where, when you brought up that, when you were saying that there was the dotted line and then eventually the solid line, was your informed, I think it was the informed and naked, the difference between the two. Now that to me was quite interesting because obviously there was an influence that having access to that information changed your perspective ultimately on how your initial viewing or initial understanding of the piece changed. I guess that's what your particular presentation was quite good at example of that. Has anyone else got examples of that? Maybe not in such the literal sense as what I had, but I know obviously Ambrose, you mentioned that you didn't really look at it, but you said you maybe looked at it a little bit afterwards. Was that what the archive?
The archive. I mean, I glanced briefly.
Okay.
I didn't use it as initial hand. Because I think for similar reasons, I want to hear the audio. I suppose from a sort of selfish point of view, I wanted to hear this piece without having, because I tend to, and it's a habit that I've got into not reading the programme notes, generally speaking, and wanted to allow myself to listen to the piece in a way that I normally do, because that's my favourite approach. I will go back to that at some point. But it was just a conceit kind of thing.
Sure. Okay. I know where we are on the camera. Was anyone else Kevin or Wayne?
Yeah, personally, I feel that there's two parts of the analysis. So in that way, the archive is very interesting to get into the composer mind at the process level. But generally, I don't care about whether or not I'm right with the composer intention, meaning. So I don't get dragged into the archive. I just really not as a score, but as something contextual, something like
As a reference, obviously.
yeah, something like that.
And Mary, do you have anything to add on? I know you're holding the camera now.
I just use the audio file in the archive, and I read it.
Yes, well the book's a number obviously this out.
Yeah, it's like some letters from my archive, which I find very difficult to
All right.
So I just read the book, and from my personal listening experience, I decided to do the audiovisual, and I take another approach to it, what I see.
Great. I guess
I'd just like to say that I'm very pleased to hear everybody say that provided the piece is what people take it to mean and not what the composer said. The archive is there purely for historical or, if you're intrigued by it, or if you're passing the point of this piece, what is this guy getting at, you can go and look at it. So just let it be available, but I don't think it is this is what my piece is, and if you don't get it, you could right.
And I guess the second question I had before I could open up was to you, Trevor, was how listening to these different perspectives on your work, and obviously you give an introduction at the beginning, and obviously hearing, I guess, different interpretations, as how that's been for you, obviously hearing people taking apart your work, as it were, in different manners, and then trying to inform an understanding from that.
Well, it's very interesting, a couple of things. There are various different aspects of things which I find. I really quite like this idea of interpreting these ambiguous characters. That's fascinating for the spin-off. But another interesting thing that arose out of the final talk was what you consciously know you're doing, and what you sort of intuitively know you're doing, and what you don't know. So in some of the things I clearly am putting the piece together with a particular kind of form and structure of these small sections. But I have to say that the theme of the piece was constructed after I'd made all the sections. So actually, you know, looking at the piece, obviously the theme comes first, then everything comes after. But in reality, the theme was made after I'd made all the sections. And that was the theme. So that's why I mean the difference between genesis and analysis.
Sure.
But there are things about why certain rhythmic devices are used and recur at a different tempi, which are difficult to know. They're there because they work, but I don't know what that means. Because when I'm working, I have the luxury of working as an actual composer. I can actually hear what I'm doing, and I can say, well, this is fantastic. I don't know why it's fantastic, but it's fantastic. I'm going to keep this. Rather than, oh, well, this fits in with the Fibonacci theory, well, 13 to 8, yes, it's good. So there are things that undoubtedly other people will discover or dismiss based on my intuitions, which who knows where they come from. And there are other things you don't know you're doing, but by accident, putting things together, you didn't even notice and someone points it out to you. Well, yeah, that's a good explanation.
So I think, Michael, you had an example very smallly with the wind chimes. No, that's right, that was Peter Batchelor, of course, with the Schenkerian analysis. You were talking about the pitch relation, and that was something that Dennis had initially accounted for, and you thought about. Oh, okay. On that moment, does anyone else? Oh, I guess we'll open up to the floor before we have any tea or coffee, based on that initial questioning. Has anyone got any other comments based on these presentations and work in general? Or does everyone just want coffee? Because we kind of finished almost on time, so we're time to start with that.
Started late. Do you want to just pose the question that we'll discuss in the last discussion bit, Mike? How would you, as Yorima person, like to follow it up? You need an answer, but put the question to the contributors, put it boldly, and see what, if anybody else has a contribution to the question. How would you like to take this forward? Because the point is about sharing this kind of thing.
Sure.
How can we carry on making it onward? What do you think?
Wow. Well, I believe I've spoken to some of the contributors personally about this, but the idea, I think, was in the actual core, was to ultimately potentially combine all these different perspectives into one succinct article, which would then be put it for peer review for the Yorima journal. Of course, we can talk about that afterwards if anyone is interested to submit to that. With regards to Yorima in general, I guess that is up for discussion, because the York archive is open and usable by anyone who would like to contribute to the Yorima project, or indeed the next issue of the e-journal. So it's really, I guess, up to the community to decide what they would feel would be most helpful.
I think it's important to stress, and we discussed this only briefly earlier, that even if you weren't one of the 5 contributors today, you might like to join the consortium. Just because we didn't make a presentation, if you wish to fit into that group and fit into that question Mike's asked, we'll talk about that in the last chunk of the
Could I just add one comment as well? I'd be quite happy for everybody to go and look at the archive in York, simply because I want them to get on with doing it. Because the idea of making digital archives, or archives of digital, is quite new to archivists. And having managed to persuade the people at the Portland Institute to take my material, what they're only going to really put some effort into it if people keep ringing and say, oh, I want some information about Trevor. Then they'll get the stuff catalogued out online. I'm not saying they're lazy or not doing it. It's just that they need a certain kind of pressure from the outside world to realise that they have to get this done. So please, good luck.
We shall.